She didn't cry when her old dog died. She simply placed her drum beside his body and started to play. Each beat like calling a soul back. No one taught her how to drum, but the whole nation went silent when they heard her. A nameless girl awakening the memory of the forgotten. Before we begin, don't forget to subscribe to our channel for more powerful storytelling films like this one. Before the first drum beat echoed, no one knew the girl's name, and perhaps she had already forgotten how to say it herself. The sky over Ada Foah was the color of rusted copper brushed by the last strokes of the sun. The wind rolled in from the Gulf of Guinea, carrying the scent of brine smoke and old wood. Small canoes bobbed gently on the tide, tethered to stakes jammed into sand that had seen more tears than footprints. In the shadow of a crumbling palm leaf hut, a girl sat alone with a drum. Dzifa, 15, too thin, too quiet, and too strange for a village where life was loud and quick. Her shoulders curved inward, as if the world pressed down on her chest. But her fingers, dark slender, were steady on the goat-skin head of the old Uwe drum that rested between her knees. She struck it once, a sound like a heartbeat, deep, calling, then again slower, louder. Behind her a rooster cried. Somewhere closer, firewood cracked inside a small clay stove. The village was preparing dinner, lighting fires, calling children, chasing chickens. But the rhythm Dzifa played cut through it all, like a story returning after being forgotten too long. 3 girls her age stopped on the dirt path behind her. Their school uniforms were faded, but neater than Dzifa's patched skirt and oversized shirt. "Who's she drumming for now?" one of them muttered. "The sea spirits, maybe," another laughed. The third stepped forward and raised her voice. "Hey, Dzifa, the dead can't hear you. You know your mama and papa are fish food." The other 2 laughed, high sharp. Dzifa didn't flinch. She kept her eyes on the horizon, where the sky bled into the sea. Her hands moved with something older than anger, older than insult. She played as if each beat was a name. Then one final strike and silence. She lowered her hands and looked down at the drumhead. The leather was cracked, worn thin at the center. But she touched it with reverence like a shrine. From behind the cooking huts, a low bark echoed. Heavy, protective. The girls froze. A dog emerged from the shadows, a lean dust-colored animal, with one torn ear and a limp on his right leg. Ako, the only companion Dzifa had. He moved with the silent gravity of a soldier returning from war. His eyes glowed amber in the low light. He walked to Dzifa, sat beside her, and faced the girls. Said nothing. Did nothing. But his presence was enough. The girls rolled their eyes and walked away. Witch child and her spirit dog, one of them spat. The sun was slipping. Dzifa reached over and scratched behind Ako's ear. He leaned into it, sighing through his nose. She smiled barely. It was the only real smile she gave anyone that day. She rose slowly, holding the drum close to her chest. As she stepped up the dune, a memory hit her, not as thought, but as color, as water. Flashback 7 years ago, dark clouds. Screaming wind, rain pounding like fists, a swollen river. Screams, the sound of wood splintering, a wave swallowing a canoe. And then a small body washed ashore. Tangled hair, limp limbs. But her arms clutched something tightly, a small drum nearly half her size. A fisherman bent down. Is she breathing? His wife beside him gasped. Look, her fingers, still wrapped around it. They lifted the child together. She was ice, blue-lipped, but her grip on the drum never loosened. Back in the present, Dzifa stood now at the edge of the village, where the palms bent low toward the ocean. Her hut stood like a scar, nothing more than 4 crooked sticks and a tarp, but it was hers. There she placed the drum on a raised bamboo shelf. She opened a tin pot of soaked gari and stirred it with her fingers. There was no sauce tonight. Just dryness and silence. Ako settled at the doorway, eyes fixed on her. You don't care if it's plain, she whispered. He wagged his tail once. She poured a bit into a coconut shell and pushed it toward him. He ate slow, always slow, as if chewing memory. Night fell harder in Ada Foah than anywhere else. The wind grew teeth. Lights flickered out. From across the beach, she could hear drums in the distance. Real drums. Ceremonial. Meant for the living. Hers weren't like that. Dzifa lay down on her raffia mat and turned her back to the world. And yet, she dreamt of drumming. Not from her hands, but from the sea. From beneath it. Of a woman singing without a mouth. Of a man whose heart pulsed like a drumbeat. Of a child lost. And the sound that could bring her home. At dawn, the tide pulled back like an exhausted breath, revealing the scars of the night before. Tangled nets, broken shells. A single dead crab curled in the sand like a forgotten prayer. The village was slow to wake. The smoke from early cooking fires floated low, hugging the huts like ghosts too tired to haunt. Dzifa was already walking barefoot across the shore, her shoulders stooped under the weight of a basket half her size. She moved with purpose, but not hope. She paused beside a pile of half-rotted fishing nets, eyeing the glint of silver inside a fish no bigger than her palm, forgotten or rejected. She reached in, pulled it free, wiped it against her skirt, and dropped it into the basket. A few more like that she could trade for oil. If not, she'd salt them and chew through the bones. Further up the beach, a woman snapped sheets of dried tilapia onto racks. Dzifa approached in silence, held out her arms. The woman looked her over, squinted. "You know how to hang them properly?" Dzifa nodded. She had done this before, many times. The woman handed her the basket without a word, and Dzifa began. Her hands were fast, gentle, like she was putting children to sleep. She worked until the sun was high and her stomach folded in on itself. Then she returned to her hut, a lean-to made of woven reeds, and plastic tarps, a structure not even fit to bury someone in. The sea, greedy and endless, had already claimed 2 corners. At night, the waves slapped the edges, whispering like hands, asking to be let in. Inside, the drum waited, the same one from the flood. The skin was dull now, the rings warped. But Dzifa treated it like a child too fragile to carry. She would rest her fingers lightly on its surface, not playing at first, just touching, remembering. No one had taught her. There were no elders who took her in, no musicians who saw her hands and said, "Let me show you." She had learned by listening. To the wind, to the water, to the silences in her own body. She would sit and wait until she felt something tighten in her ribs like a string being pulled. Then she'd play. Never the same rhythm twice, never from memory, only from feeling. Some days it sounded like morning, others like a heartbeat racing through a nightmare. And then there were nights like this one. A storm was coming. The air turned thick, heavy with anticipation. The villagers shouted to each other across the wind, pulling their nets up from the tide, slamming doors, tightening ropes. Dzifa had no ropes to tighten. Her hut flapped wildly as she lay inside, curled around the drum arms, locked as though afraid it might be stolen by the storm itself. Rain hammered the roof like fists of the dead. Akko had disappeared. She called once, twice, then gave up. Thunder split the air. Lightning lit the sky with the color of old bone. Her skin began to shiver, then convulse. A wave of heat rolled through her stomach, followed by the deepest cold she had ever felt. She was burning, then freezing. She tried to sit up, but the sky spun sideways. Her head dropped back onto the mat. Then everything went black. A knock. No, not a knock. A scratching. Furious. Urgent. A man's voice. "What is it? What do you want?" The door creaked open. A flashlight clicked on. A face appeared, furrowed and gray-bearded eyes clouded by age, but sharpened by panic. This was Kwame the candy seller. Deaf in one ear, nearly blind in the other. Everyone said he'd gone senile since his wife died. But he followed the dog. He had seen the animal bark, run, return, bark again, then run once more. Something about the way it moved. Not wild, not begging, commanding. He found Dzifa curled on the floor, her body convulsing in silence. He lifted her, barely able to carry her weight, and stumbled into the rain with Akko running ahead. In the village clinic, the nurse shook her head. "Fever's too high. She won't last the night if she stays here." They had no ambulance, no IV fluids, just a wet cloth, old paracetamol, and the smell of bleach. Akko refused to leave the room. He stood at the foot of the bed, soaked, shivering, snarling at anyone who came too close. Inside Dzifa's mind, there was drumming. Not her hands, not her drum. Inside her, boom, boom, boom. Then silence, then voices, low, far away. A man's laughter. A woman singing. Words in Yue. A song she had never learned but knew by instinct. Then the beat returned, but this time it wasn't calling out. It was calling back, to her. A flood of images, her mother's face bending low with a spoon of soup. Her father carrying her on his shoulders down to the shore. The canoe, the wave, the darkness, the silence. She reached out in the dark arms, trembling. Her fingers brushed fur. She woke with a gasp. Her body was drenched, not in fever now, but in salt sweat and tears and sea. Her eyes opened to a flickering bulb, a metal ceiling fan that didn't spin, a window half broken. And at her side, curled half-asleep, ears twitching, was Akko. He lifted his head, licked her wrist. She stared at him for a long time, unsure if she was still dreaming. Then she wrapped her arms around his neck and began to cry. No, not cry, collapse, break, the kind of weeping that shakes the lungs, that pulls from the stomach like dry heaves. Not because of pain, but because something cracked open, and there was light inside. She cried for the years of silence, for every meal missed, for every word never spoken, for every name she whispered into the drum, and for the dog who answered. She held him like he was her last link to the living. He didn't move, only blinked, waited, watched her, as if to say, I know. The sky cracked open with light, not lightning this time, but the piercing gold of late morning sun, sharp, restless, full of questions. The ocean reflected it in broken fragments, as if even the water didn't know how to hold such clarity. Far down the beach, a drone buzzed. The soft whir of machinery, trying to make sense of nature. A group of 5 walked along the shoreline, 3 men, 2 women, all carrying bags, booms, cases, and the cautious curiosity of outsiders. They were a Ghanaian-French film crew, traveling the coast to collect ambient sound for a documentary on ancestral rhythms and the oral legacy of the Yu people. Their project was titled Echoes of the Mother Drum. The crew had passed villages where old men played flutes made from bird bone, where women hummed lullabies to cassava plants. But nothing stayed with them. Not until today. Not until that sound. The moment it happened, they had been setting up the mic to catch the pulse of the tide, one long boom to match the quiet inhale of the sand. The drone was already airborne. Then the drum began. It wasn't clean. It wasn't polished. It was raw, uneven. The first few strikes seemed unsure, searching. But then came a rhythm so urgent, so broken and beautiful, that the sound technician's hands froze on his console. He blinked hard, looked up. Turn off the drone, said the director. No, Amma, wait. I think it's coming from. Turn it off. Amma's voice didn't rise. It narrowed. Her hands, brown, strong, elegant, even with the swelling of her 3rd trimester belly, tightened around the base of the boom mic. Everyone paused. Then they heard it clearly. A drum somewhere beyond the dune. Faster now. Agitated. A rhythm like breath that had been trapped underwater too long. The drone lowered and landed with a hum. The camera operator turned toward the direction of the sound and began rolling. But the image came out jittery. The lens kept trying to focus, but the camera itself shivered slightly, as if the rhythm it heard bled into the mechanics. Amma stood still, head tilted. Where's that coming from? They followed the sound, over the dune, past a rusted canoe half buried in the sand, around a crumbling stone wall, until there she was, a girl, young, alone, barefoot, sitting cross-legged on a small mat of rags. Her hands flying over a worn-out drum, her eyes closed, body stiff like a wire pulled too tight. Every beat came from the center of her chest, traveling through her shoulders, elbows, wrists. Her face was expressionless, but the sound grief, fury, memory. It reached them without permission, without explanation. Amma didn't breathe for a full 20 seconds. Then quietly she said, "Stop filming." "But Amma," I said, "stop." The camera lowered. The sound crew stared, not sure if they'd stumbled into something sacred or something forbidden. Dzifa finished. Her hands hovered above the drum for a moment longer, as if unsure whether to rest. Then, with great care, she lowered them into her lap. She opened her eyes and saw them. She didn't flinch, didn't run. Her expression didn't even change. She simply stared. Amma stepped forward, slowly. "Hello," she said softly, unsure if the girl could hear her. Dzifa didn't respond. Akko appeared from behind a log, growling low. Amma stopped in her tracks, but Dzifa raised one hand gently. The dog obeyed reluctantly, settling at her side, never taking his eyes off the strangers. Amma crouched. A twinge of discomfort passed through her back, and she placed one hand on her belly. "My name is Amma," she said. Silence. She tried again this time, tapping her chest. "Amma." Then she pointed. "You." Dzifa blinked, then looked down at her drum. She tapped it twice, then again, slower. 3 beats, then a pause, then 2 beats, then silence. Amma didn't understand the rhythm, but she recognized language. She placed her hand on her own chest again. "Amma," she pointed to herself, then to Dzifa. Dzifa looked away, but her fingers started tapping the drum's edge, soft now, like a whisper. Then she held up 5 fingers, then 2. Amma paused, 7. Dzifa nodded once, then drew a line on the sand. She tapped the start of the line, then the end, then rested her palm in the middle. Amma squinted, thinking. "You were 7 when something happened." Her eyes softened. "You're Dzifa." A small flicker passed through Dzifa's eyes. Recognition. Dzifa didn't nod, but she didn't deny it either. Amma reached into her satchel and pulled out a tiny digital recorder. She held it in both hands, like an offering. She pressed play. The crew had managed to capture 30 seconds of Dzifa's drumming. The sound came out of the recorder like thunder trapped in a shell. Harsh, real, broken, beautiful. Dzifa jerked her head up. Her face tightened. She stood abruptly, grabbed the drum, and backed away. Akko barked once. "No," Dzifa said softly, the first word she'd spoken. Amma stood too. "I'm not here to take anything from you. You recorded it." "I did, but I didn't understand until now." "It's not for understanding." Amma paused. "What is it for?" Dzifa pressed the drum to her chest. "It's them," she whispered. "My mother. My father." She tapped the wood with her knuckles. "They are here." Amma blinked. "You mean their memory?" She pointed at the drum again. "They live in this." A breeze cut across the dunes, scattering sand like ash. Amma steadied herself against the weight of the moment. Not just the drum, the girl, the defiance in her voice, the wound in her eyes. Amma stepped forward again, carefully, barefoot now. She sat beside Dzifa on the sand. Their knees almost touched. "May I ask you something?" Dzifa didn't answer. "I've spent the last 6 months traveling to find the real sound of the old Yue drums." Amma said, her voice low and sure. "Not the ones in theaters. Not the ones cleaned up for ceremonies. The real ones. The ones that used to speak before we had words." Dzifa stared at her. "I've recorded over 20 villages," Amma continued. "Hundreds of beats. But none like yours." Dzifa's eyes narrowed. "What?" "Because yours isn't trying to impress anyone." She paused. "It's calling someone." A long silence. Then Dzifa said, almost too quiet to hear, "I don't want you to take it. You'll clean it. You'll turn it into something people clap for. You'll kill what it means." Amma didn't argue. She simply nodded. "You're right. That's what most people do." She looked out to sea, eyes glassy. "But I'm not most people." Her hand rested on her belly. "This is my first child. A girl. I haven't named her yet." Dzifa watched her carefully. "I want her to know the sound that brought me to you," Amma said. "Not as entertainment, but as a prayer, as a reminder." She turned to Dzifa. "Let the world hear your prayer." Dzifa's throat tightened. She looked down at her drum, then at the recorder, then at Akko. He stared back, quiet now. She closed her eyes and nodded. The broadcast began with silence, not the expected drum roll or national anthem. Not the polished voice of a presenter introducing the Lehua Vanhua Kwuksa in Accra. No grand crescendo, no orchestral opening. Just silence, then sand, then breath, and then one note. A beat slow and uneven, a heartbeat too broken to be mechanical. A drum ancient and frayed, echoing across the stadium speakers like the first cry of something that had crawled out of grief. Unpolished, unpredictable, alive. The massive LED screens lit up, not with performers, not with dancers, but a single static image, an unnamed beach. A barefoot girl, a cracked drum. Her eyes closed. The sea behind her, A dog beside her like a ghost turned to flesh. Inside the stadium, tens of thousands held their breath. At home, families across the country leaned toward their televisions. In classrooms, cafes, even trotros stuck in Accra traffic. The sound poured through speakers like smoke slipping under locked doors. The rhythm stumbled, then surged. A beat, a pause. 2 quick strikes, then silence. A pattern that didn't repeat because it wasn't meant to. It was not music. It was memory with a pulse. Then a second beat came softer, like breath caught in a throat. Somewhere in the crowd, a little girl began to cry. Her mother reached for her shoulder, but didn't ask why. A few rows down, an old woman removed her headscarf, folded it neatly, and pressed it to her eyes. On stage, nothing happened, because everything was happening. The MC stood at the edge of the spotlight, visibly shaken. His script fluttered in his hand. He looked off stage, searching for a cue that never came. Backstage, Amma stood in the shadows. She wasn't holding the mic. She wasn't even watching the screen. She had her hand on her belly, eyes closed, tears clinging to the edge of her lashes. It was Dzifa's recording, unedited, unmastered, pure. 37 seconds long. The crowd didn't clap when it ended. They didn't know if they were supposed to. It wasn't performance, it was confession. And no one claps at a confession. Online, the silence didn't last. Within 5 minutes, hashtags flooded Twitter and TikTok. The drum that cried "Han Ghost song, who is she? This is not just music." A 15-second clip of the audio posted by a university student went viral. "Forget your playlists," she wrote. "This isn't a beat. This is someone finding her parents in the dark." Another user commented, "It's not even technically good. But I cried like I lost someone." And another, "This isn't technique. This is truth." It spread like fire across dry grass. Not for what it was, but for what it made people feel. Pain that wasn't theirs. Grief they hadn't earned. And love they didn't expect to remember. By the next morning, Dzifa's image was on the front page of 2 national newspapers, though nobody knew her name yet. The headline was simple: "The Drum That Found Us." Journalists began tracing Amma's documentary trail. A few found her old production assistant, who gave them a name, Ada Foah. Somewhere near the old salt flat. She said it was a girl. Young, maybe mute. Within hours, reporters were on the road, bouncing over potholes and back roads. Cameras, ready faces, rehearsed with the kind of sympathetic curiosity that often comes too late. They reached the village by sunset. But the village had nothing to give. Most didn't even know Dzifa lived there. They had seen her, yes, on the beach, with the dog with that drum. They remembered chasing her away from their drying nets. They remembered their children mocking her, but they didn't know her name. "Just the orphan girl," one man said, "the one that talks to wind." "She's still here?" a woman asked. The reporters left with empty notebooks. One of them, a young journalist fresh out of Legan, remained. She stood by the shoreline, where Amma's crew had first heard Dzifa's rhythm. She waited. She waited for the sound again. But the sea was quiet that night. Back in the village, Dzifa sat inside her hut, unaware of her own rising myth. She didn't have a phone, no television. The idea of being heard in a cry of her hands echoing through a stadium was a story meant for someone else. She thought maybe the recording had failed, or that Amma had changed her mind. She told herself it didn't matter, that it was better this way, that her parents' spirits could rest again, that Akko would never have to share her with the world, that the silence was a kind of safety until Amma returned. It wasn't a grand arrival, no limousine, no cameras. Amma stepped down from a dusty trotro with swollen ankles and a scarf wrapped around her head to hide from the attention she was already trying to avoid. She walked to Dzifa's hut, barefoot, and paused. She waited, listening. No drum, no sound. Then she whispered, "Dzifa." The flap lifted. Dzifa stood there, silent, until she saw Amma's face. The quiet between them was not the same silence as before. It was charged, full. Amma sat down on the low wooden stool just outside the door. She winced, her back aching from the journey, her belly heavier now. Dzifa sat across from her, not speaking. Amma pulled a folded newspaper from her bag and passed it over. Dzifa unfolded it. Her own image stared back at her, not smiling, not performing, just sitting with a drum in her lap and a dog at her side. Underneath the caption, "The girl who made Ghana weep." Dzifa's hands trembled. "I didn't mean for them to hear," she whispered. "I know," Amma said gently. I only wanted them to come home. My mother, my father. Amma nodded. And somehow you brought everyone else home too. She placed a small envelope on the ground between them. An invitation, official, embossed. Dzifa didn't touch it. You want me to go to Accra? Amma shook her head. No, they want you to go. To speak. I don't have words. You already spoke. I'm not like them. They're not like you either. That's why they need you. Dzifa looked down at her hands. They still smelled faintly of salt. I'm scared. So was I. The first time I gave birth to a story I didn't understand. Amma leaned in, eyes fierce but soft. Dzifa, the world is listening. Don't let silence be the only thing they hear next. Dzifa was quiet for a long time. Akko walked over, leaned against her leg, and stared at Amma. Then Dzifa spoke. Will I be alone? Amma smiled. No, you're already not. The word left Dzifa's mouth like a stone-flat final. Amma stood beneath the makeshift awning, the invitation still clutched in her hand. Rain patted down on the rusted tin roofs of Ada Foah like hesitant applause. From the corner, Akko stirred but did not rise. Dzifa shook her head again, more quietly this time. I don't have shoes to go anywhere. Amma blinked. We can get you shoes. I've never worn shiny dresses. I don't know how to walk in them. I don't know how to speak in front of eyes. She paused. Her voice cracked brittle like wind-dried paper. I don't belong in places with microphones. Amma stepped closer. No one belongs there until they arrive. But Dzifa's arms were wrapped tightly around herself, now the posture of someone holding in pieces. She looked past Amma toward the edge of the village, where the trees bent in wind and old stories never got buried deep enough. When I walk through the market, they still whisper. The whispers had started days ago. At the washing line, she's the one from the radio, eh? That orphan girl at the water well. They say the drum was cursed. That's why her parents drowned. And worse, behind hands between closed doors after dark. She speaks to dogs. She carries death in her music. Beware girls who rise from rivers. By the third morning, the rumors had thickened into suspicion. She was walking back from the shoreline with Akko when it happened. A man blocked her path. He stood broad and drunk, sweat pooling beneath his arms. Eyes red not just from the drink, but from years of everything gone wrong. Dzifa recognized him instantly. Mr. Senyo. Her father had once traded smoked fish with him. After the flood, he'd called her a cursed child. Had spit on the sand near her feet. Now he stood before her again, smelling of palm wine and regret. But this time he wasn't just talking. He was carrying something. Her drum. The old one. The one she thought Amma had packed safely. I heard the recording, he slurred. Heard your crying drum on the radio. Dzifa's heart thudded in her ears. He dropped it to the sand. You think you're better than the rest of us now, eh? Just because your ghost's got a microphone. Akko stepped forward, growling. Mr. Senyo's lips curled. He lifted his foot and brought it down. The crack of wood echoed like thunder. The drum split in two, leather tearing frames snapping. For a moment, nothing moved. Then Akko lunged. He wasn't a large dog, but he was fast, anger wrapped in fur. His teeth sank into the man's arm before the villagers could blink. Mr. Senyo roared, swinging wildly, trying to shake the dog off. Dzifa screamed, not words, not syllables, just sound. Then, don't! It tore from her chest like the first wind after a drought. Everyone froze, even the dog, even the man bleeding into the sand. Don't, she whispered again, falling to her knees. Akko backed away, blood on his teeth, whimpering. Dzifa crawled to him, cradled his head. Blood has leaked down her shirt, dark and hot against her ribs. He licked her chin once. She held him, rocking back and forth as villagers began to gather. No one spoke at first. Then the murmurs came. She finally talked. She said, don't. She spoke. But Dzifa wasn't listening. Her fingers were on Akko's fur. She could feel the wound on his shoulder. Shallow, but bleeding. He was hurt for her. Because of her. Because the world couldn't stand a girl who carried her pain on her drum instead of in her silence. She looked at the broken instrument. Then at the man, now being pulled away by two other villagers. And then at the children watching from a distance, wide-eyed, barefoot, hiding behind their mothers. She saw them clearly for the first time. Not just as villagers' children, but as mirrors. Every one of them, a child with a story not yet broken open. A voice not yet allowed. A drum not yet offered. Later that night, she sat outside her hut with Akko curled beside her wound, cleaned, bandaged with strips of old cloth. He slept, ears twitching now and then at the wind. The stars overhead blinked slowly, as if listening. Amma returned quiet. She didn't ask questions. She simply placed something next to Dzifa on the ground. Not shoes, not a dress, but a new drum. Plain, untouched. Dzifa looked at it, then up at Amma, and said nothing. Amma turned to leave. But Dzifa's voice caught her at the edge of the dark. "I'll go." Amma turned back. "Are you sure?" "I'm not going for them, not even for me." She looked down at Akko. He bled to protect a voice the world tried to bury. Her fingers touched the new drum's rim. "I'll go because somewhere there's a girl who thinks she has to stay quiet to survive." She raised her eyes again, and maybe she'll hear this, and scream, and finally feel safe. Accra had too many lights, too many horns, too many moving parts. The sky there didn't end in ocean. It ended in billboards, tangled wires, and restless shadows. For Dzifa, who had never left the smell of the tide or the sound of sand against palm trees, it felt like being swallowed whole. The van pulled up to the rear entrance of the National Theater. The doors opened like jaws. Dzifa stepped out barefoot, clutching her drum. Akko leapt out beside her, sniffing the cement tail stiff. The city smelled like metal and too much heat. Not a single scent of sea. Inside, people buzzed like trapped bees, performers and glitter organizers with clipboards, dancers stretching voices, calling cues. No one looked like Dzifa. No one moved like Dzifa. She stood still, unsure where her body was supposed to belong. A woman in a headset rushed toward them. "That's the girl." Amma nodded. "Yes." The woman scanned Dzifa, her plain wrap dress, bare feet, the old drum. "And the dog, he's with her," Amma said calmly. The woman frowned. "No animals on stage. It's in the rules." Amma's lips tightened. She crouched next to Dzifa. "He can stay just off stage, all right. He'll hear you. You'll feel him." Dzifa looked at Akko. He looked back, calm, blinking. She nodded. Backstage, a wardrobe assistant approached with arms full of fabric, bright, shiny, too clean. "You'll wear this," she said. "We need it to match the others." Dzifa touched the sequin jacket. Her hand recoiled. Amma stepped in. "She can wear something simpler, something that—" "Sorry," the assistant interrupted. "It's a uniform segment. We already rehearsed transitions. The color schemes are set. No time to change." Amma clenched her jaw. Dzifa said nothing. She let them dress her like a mannequin. When they handed her a set of high black heels, she stared at them like weapons. "I can't walk in these." "Just try," someone snapped. "You're not the only one performing tonight." Rehearsal passed in chaos. The coordinator gave her a pattern 4 beats, then pause. 2 beats. Then sync with the backing track. She tried. Her hands fumbled. The rhythm slipped. A dancer hissed, "She's off tempo again." The music director muttered, "Who even booked this?" Dzifa's heart climbed into her throat. Akko barked once from behind the curtain. "Keep that mutt quiet." She looked at the floor where her new shoes were already blistering her toes. Then it was time. The stage lights hit her like sun through a magnifying glass. Blinding. Hot. The curtain rose. She was center. Behind her, the pre-recorded orchestral rhythm ticked softly in her earpiece. In front of her, an audience of hundreds. And on the first beat, she missed it. She struck too early. The second beat too soft. The third panicked. The tempo shattered. Someone in the crowd laughed. Then another. A wave of uncomfortable murmurs. She dropped the sticks. Silence. And then, like it was happening in a different world, altogether. The MC's voice slid in, trying to cover the rupture with a smile too wide, to be honest. "Well, that was experimental, wasn't it?" Scattered laughter. Dzifa turned and walked off stage before the applause or the pity could reach her. Behind the curtain, the breath in her chest shattered. She pulled at the jacket, at the shoes, at the fabric that didn't belong on her skin. Her fingers trembled too badly to undo the buttons. The drum in her arms felt like it weighed mountains. Amma found her in a corner, curled on the floor, breath hitching, face wet. "I can't do this," Dzifa whispered. They laughed. "They didn't understand," Amma said. "They're not supposed to," Dzifa snapped. That rhythm, they wanted something they could dance to. Something with rules. She pressed her forehead to the drumhead. "This isn't meant for their lights." Amma sat beside her. "I never asked you to play for them." "Then why am I here?" Amma reached into her bag, pulled out an old small speaker. She clicked it on. A familiar sound spilled into the air, the raw, untouched recording of Dzifa's first beach session. The drum, her drum, not perfect, not practiced, but alive. A girl calling her dead parents across water. Amma looked at her. You hear that? Dzifa nodded, tears lining her jaw. That's who you are. Before the lights, before the microphones. She paused. Don't let them take that from you. Moments later, someone called from side stage. We're behind schedule. Either she goes now, or we cut. Amma stood, then turned to Dzifa. Play what's in your chest, not what's on the schedule. Dzifa rose, barefoot. No sequins, no shoes, just herself, her drum, her skin. The curtain opened again. No announcement, no intro, just her, standing alone. She sat. The lights dimmed to a single spotlight. The audience murmured. Someone whispered, "That's the girl from the mistake." She placed her hands bare, trembling on the drum. She closed her eyes and began. Not a pattern, a prayer, not a rhythm, a release. Soft at first, like breathing underwater. Then a rush, a cascade. Fingers finding what the soul remembered. Her palms rose and fell in conversation with ghosts. No backing track, no orchestra, no sync, just truth. And the room fell silent. Not a hush, a vacuum. Like every ear had leaned forward, and no one remembered how to move. Dzifa didn't look up. She didn't need to. She wasn't playing for them. She was playing through them. When it ended, no one clapped. Not because they didn't want to, but because it felt wrong, like applauding a funeral, or a birth, or both. In the shadows off stage, Akko lay with his head resting on his paws, ears tilted forward. He didn't bark. He just listened, and knew. For the first full second after Dzifa stopped playing, there was only breathing. Not applause, not words. Just breath. The entire auditorium felt suspended, as if everyone had inhaled at once and forgotten how to exhale. Then slowly, movement began, not in the hands of critics, but in the bodies of those who remembered. An old woman in the front row pressed both palms to her chest and began to murmur softly in Yue. Her voice cracked like the edges of a faded hymn. In the back, a little boy, who hadn't spoken in weeks, began tapping his palms against the wooden chair arms, offbeat at first, but growing in confidence, echoing what he just heard. And in the center rows, adults wiped their eyes, some openly, some hiding behind programs and phones. What Dzifa had done wasn't art. It was invocation. Something ancient and nameless had been called back not by force, but by permission. She walked off stage without bowing, without waiting for cue or praise. She didn't need any of it. Amma met her behind the curtain, her eyes red-rimmed but smiling. In one hand she held her belly. In the other, a single folded paper. Dzifa glanced at it. "What's that?" A future Amma said, placing it in her hand. Dzifa unfolded it, a letterhead in elegant font. "U Institute for Indigenous Musical Heritage." She blinked. "Is this?" "They want you," Amma said. "Full scholarship, no tests, no auditions, just your hands." Dzifa couldn't speak. Amma reached over and squeezed her wrist. "I told them you don't play for crowds. You play for spirits. And they said those are the best kind of students." Dzifa looked down at the letter again. Her fingers shook. Not from fear this time, but from something more dangerous. Hope. 3 weeks passed. Accra became less terrifying. Dzifa stayed with Amma in her modest 2-bedroom flat near a ridge. The floors were warm wood, the walls honey-colored. The scent of ginger and coconut milk drifted in from the kitchen every morning like a lullaby. She still didn't say much, but she began to laugh. Once while peeling plantains with Amma. Another time when Akko chased his tail and slammed into the couch. The laugh surprised them both. And one morning, Dzifa came to breakfast barefoot with a pattern of ink drawn in Yue symbols on her wrist. Amma smiled. "You're becoming yourself." Dzifa shrugged. "I think I was always her. Just buried." Then in early morning rain, Amma went into labor. It was fast, fierce, messy, like all honest beginnings. Dzifa passed outside the clinic. Akko pressed to her side, ears twitching with every muffled cry through the wall. An hour passed. Then a nurse stepped out with a grin so wide it broke the storm. "She's here," the woman said, "and healthy." Amma, sweaty and glowing, held a tiny bundle to her chest. "Come," she said. Dzifa stepped in, unsure how to hold breath, how to hold space. Amma looked up at her. "Would you like to meet her?" Dzifa nodded. "She has no name yet," Amma said. "But I've chosen her middle one." She looked straight into Dzifa's eyes. "Dzifa!" The world tilted. Dzifa moved forward like a sleepwalker. Amma held out the newborn. Dzifa reached out hands that once trembled with every note, now perfectly steady. She cradled the child. Their eyes met. The infant blinked, unfazed by this new world. The girl holding her, however, felt as though time had folded inward. She had once been carried like this, cold, wet, with a drum pressed to her chest. Now she was the arms, the warmth, the return. She didn't cry, but something inside her settled. Not everything needed to break to be beautiful. 2 days later, the letter from Ada Foah arrived. Not written by hand. Typed, formal, stamped. Not from a neighbor. From the municipal office. Eviction and clearance. Notification. Coastal Redevelopment Zone, C. The document explained that the temporary dwellings along the Ada Foah coast, primarily the informal ones, were to be cleared. The land had been leased to a hospitality investor for the construction of a seaside resort. The words were dry: unsafe housing, public interest, environmental restoration. But between the lines, Dzifa read the real meaning. You don't belong here anymore. Neither do the other children. Not the mute boy who lived beneath the fishing racks. Not the twins who made boats from bottle caps. Not the old woman who still spoke to the tide. They would be erased to make way for wealth. Dzifa sat in the window that night, the letter open on her knees, the sounds of Accra blurring behind her. Amma stood in the kitchen, rocking the baby slowly. Outside, thunder rumbled low, far off, not yet angry, but thinking. Akko padded over and dropped a dried coconut shell at her feet. She didn't smile this time. Instead, she whispered, "We gave them our sound." She looked out at the night, jaw clenched. Now they want our shore. The first thing Dzifa noticed when she returned to Ada Foah was the wind. It was still there, still carrying salt, still lifting the corners of tarps and the ends of skirts, still whispering down the coastline like a mother calling children home. It hadn't changed, but everything else had. The beach was marked now with red flags stuck in the sand, like warnings from a war that hadn't been fought yet. Surveyor lines cut across old paths. Bamboo homes were tagged with chalk letters RZC. Redevelopment Zone C. Children no longer played near the water. Vendors looked at the ocean with suspicion. The sky felt tighter. She walked past familiar faces. Many looked away. Some stared. A few whispered. But when her feet touched the edge of the same stretch of beach where she had once sat alone with her drum, something inside her clicked into place. It was time to make noise again. By sunset, she was no longer alone. Kojo, barely 14, brought his cousin's phone. "I saw your video online," he said. "They think you're famous." Dzifa shook her head. "That doesn't matter now. What matters is what they want to take. Everything." She nodded. "Everything." He tilted his head. "So what do we do?" She looked out at the water, then down at her hands, then back to him. "We drum." That night they gathered on the shore, 6 of them at first. Then 10, then almost 30, young, barefoot, uncertain. Most had never held a drum. Some brought pots, plastic buckets, tin bowls. Others just brought hands. Kojo's cousin started recording on his phone. Dzifa didn't give a speech. She just sat, right where the tide kissed the earth. She touched her drum once, twice, then waited. They followed. Rhythms emerged, not in unison, not rehearsed, but real. The kind of real that doesn't care about perfection. The night swallowed their sound, but the phones caught it. Faces lit by moonlight, eyes closed in surrender, beats rising like smoke. Dzifa finally looked up into the camera. "This," she said, "is not just sand. It's memory." She turned toward the sea. "And we are not debris. We are the children of the wind." By morning, the video had reached thousands. By the next day, hundreds of thousands. Who is she? Where is this beach? What is orphan drum? We are not debris. A popular blogger from Kumasi reposted it with the caption, "They tried to bury them. Instead, they planted a song." A week later, 2 journalists arrived, one from Accra, one from Côte d'Ivoire. They didn't come with questions. They came with notebooks, recorders, and silence. They listened, then they wrote. One article titled, "The Drum at the Edge of Disappearance," trended for 3 days. Another essay, published in both English and French, was called "The Wind That Raised the Forgotten." And then came the piece that turned everything, "The Orphan Drum," Dzifa's fight for a vanishing shore. The writer didn't focus on nostalgia. She focused on injustice, on policy, on the children born without choices, on the rhythms made from bones and grief. She ended with a line that burned through every screen. "If a drum can carry memory, then silence is not an option." That's when he appeared again, Mr. Senyo, the same man who had broken her drum. The same man whose arm still bore a faint scar from Ako's teeth. He stood at the edge of the gathering one evening as Dzifa taught 5 new girls how to slap rhythm from wood. He didn't speak at first. Then he stepped forward. He was not drunk, not angry. He looked hollow, but humbled. "I lost a daughter," he said. The words fell out like stones from a wound, the same flood that took your parents. "She was 5. He paused. "I thought maybe the storm was looking for someone else. That it had picked wrong, that if I blamed someone, the water wouldn't come again." He looked her in the eye. "I blamed you." The girls behind her stopped drumming. Dzifa stood, quiet. He dropped his eyes. "I was wrong." He turned to leave, but she stepped forward and placed her hand over his. His skin trembled beneath hers. "We are all orphans," she said in one way or another. He looked at her, then nodded once, then left. The next morning, an emergency meeting was called at the district council office. The redevelopment project was under scrutiny. Too much attention, too much noise, too many eyes. Local lawmakers sat rigid as NGO workers, reporters, and even international observers packed the back of the room. Amma was there holding her baby. Kojo stood beside her recording everything live on a borrowed phone. The lead official cleared his throat. "We are reviewing the permit for the coastal development under Section 6. Dzifa stood. Everyone turned. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't need to. "I was born on that shore." She pointed to the reporter who had written the essay. "She wasn't." She turned to the man in the suit. "You weren't." She looked at the full room. "But I don't speak alone." She opened her satchel, pulled out the new drum, not to perform, to place on the table. And then she sat. The silence that followed wasn't awkward. It was listening. 2 weeks later, the verdict was announced. The project would be paused indefinitely, the resort permit rescinded, the land reclassified as a cultural heritage preservation zone. The government released a statement. "In recognition of the significance of oral memory, indigenous rhythm, and community preservation, we commit to building on this site a center for vocational and cultural restoration, a place to teach, to remember, to drum, for free, for children, for ghosts, for wind." The first drum class didn't begin with a schedule, or a syllabus, or even drums. It began with children, 7 of them. None of them were used to looking anyone in the eyes. 2 couldn't hear. 1 didn't speak. 3 were labeled too slow by every school that had quietly removed them. The last one, Amosa, simply hadn't been touched in so long, he flinched at kindness. But they came, not because they trusted Dzifa, because they trusted the sound. The thrum they heard echoing from the coast at dusk, mournful, strong, without explanation. It was not a call. It was an acknowledgement. "I know you. I see you. I carry the same weight." So they came, some barefoot, some without parents, all with something broken and unspoken curled up inside. Dzifa didn't introduce herself. She didn't ask them to. She laid her palms on the drumhead and waited. Waited until the silence between them wasn't frightening, but expectant. Then she tapped once, one small beat, and looked up. A boy, the one who didn't speak, blinked. Then tapped the side of his tin plate with a spoon. Another beat. Then another girl, older, lifted her foot and stomped once in time. A rhythm was born, not taught, shared. There was no chalkboard in the new center, only woven mats. Second-hand buckets, upturned calabashes, and 6 handmade drums. Each one donated by someone who read the article or watched the video or remembered a childhood rhythm they'd forgotten until Dzifa reminded them. The center was nothing more than a 3-walled structure with a thatch roof built exactly where her hut had once stood. But it filled every afternoon with thunder. Not angry thunder, thunder that said, "We are here." Ako sat at the entrance every day. His bones now moved slower. His eyes clouded slightly, but he still knew how to watch. The children learned not to fear his growl, not to be startled when he limped closer to nudge their feet or rested his head on their knees. They began to wait for him. He became part of the class. They called him the drummer without hands. One girl, 8 years old and mute, spent every break curled up against his ribs, fingers tracing the faded scar on his shoulder. She never asked what caused it. She knew. Dzifa never told her to stop. She taught not with words, but with breath. She showed them how to listen, not to her, but to the world, to the wind that moved in rhythm, to the waves that knew when to retreat. to the silence inside them that still echoed long after the hurt. One day, Amosa, the boy who flinched at kindness, hit the drum too hard and cracked the skin. The others fell quiet. He stared at the damage like he'd killed something sacred. But Dzifa simply walked over, placed his hands on the broken edge, and began tapping a new rhythm with her own knuckles on the torn surface. It still made sound. Different, raw, beautiful. Amosa began to smile. Months passed, and the drumming never stopped. Word spread, not across the internet this time. Across villages, old women sent their grandchildren. Fishermen donated rope for straps. Tourists brought notebooks, but forgot to write. They sat and cried instead. But Dzifa never performed. She never took the stage again. She taught. She watched. She became something larger than the child who once sat alone beside a sea that took everything. One night, after a long session, she stayed back while the others left. Ako lay nearby, chest rising slowly. Dzifa watched him. He had aged more quickly in recent weeks, slept longer, moved less. She knew what it meant, but refused to say it out loud. Instead, she brought her drum close and began to play, not for the children, not for the spirits, but for him, low, gentle, like rocking a heartbeat. The rhythm wasn't sad. It was thank you. Thank you for staying. Thank you for fighting. Thank you for being the only one who never left. That night, the children camped outside the center. It wasn't planned. It just happened. They brought Matt's pots of porridge tin lanterns. They set up a ring and asked Dzifa to drum them to sleep. She didn't argue. She sat in the center, surrounded by fireflies and faces filled with a kind of peace that only comes from being heard. Ako lay at her feet. She played softly, almost like lullaby. Each child's head dropped one by one into the arms of sleep. The moon rose higher, and still she played. Her hands steady, her face calm. She wasn't just drumming. She was keeping time for them, holding open the door to dreams. A woman watched from beyond the edge of light, middle-aged, wrapped in a kente shawl, a face lined with storms. She stepped forward. Dzifa saw her and nodded. The woman asked, "How did you learn to do this?" Dzifa didn't stop playing. "How did you know the rhythm they needed?" Dzifa looked at her eyes, dark, steady. "Because I was once lost," she said. "And I waited for someone to find me." She tapped the drum once harder. No one came. Another beat. So I learned to echo. She smiled faintly. And now, the echo brings them home. The International Festival stage in Accra was a temple of light. Cascading banners from over 40 countries rippled overhead, like the tongues of ancestors. Cameras swiveled like curious birds. Languages blended in the air, carried by heat and excitement. This year's theme, Roots and Resonance. Every performer came adorned embroidery feathers, mirrored beads, silk paint, flashing color, choreographed spectacle. But when Dzifa stepped into the light, silence moved ahead of her, like a ripple of breath. She wore white, not ivory, not sequins, not show. A cotton shift dress, the kind worn to ceremonies that buried things and birthed things alike. Her feet were bare, her shoulders square, her face open. And in her hands, she carried the first drum, the cracked one now repaired, not perfectly. The leather was uneven. The rings rebound with rope and glue. But it was hers, her story, her spine, her voice. The announcer whispered her name over the mic, not as an introduction, but as a reverence. No title, no awards, just Dzifa. She walked to center stage and paused. Her eyes scanned the thousands, ministers, children, ambassadors, villagers who had walked half a day just to see her. She didn't bow. She didn't speak. She turned, raised her hand, and 4 children stepped out from the wings. Gasps whispered through the crowd. The first was Amosa, once too broken to trust anyone. The second, a deaf girl who had never been to school. The third and fourth were siblings from the Salt Flats, quiet and thin. Once left outside a clinic with nothing but matching bracelets and a note no one could read. Now they each carried a drum. They walked in rhythm, not perfection. The moment their feet touched the stage, they became more than children. They became a choir of survival. They stood beside Dzifa in a semicircle. No music played. No conductor raised a hand. Just Dzifa exhaling softly, eyes closed. And then she struck. One beat, a breath. A beat again. The children followed. Tentative at first, their hands shook. But her rhythm anchored them. The tempo grew. Not wild, not loud. True, it didn't tell a story. It was a story. The rhythm was jagged, then soft. Broken, then rebuilt. At times it skipped just like memory. At times it surged just like grief. And then a silence between notes, pregnant wholly. People in the audience began to sway, not to dance, but to feel. Tears fell quietly in the third row. A woman covered her mouth and the back shoulders, shaking. Someone whispered in French, "This isn't performance. This is resurrection." When the final note faded, there was no applause. Only breath again. And Dzifa, still strong, bowed slightly, not in submission, but in offering. The children followed. They walked off stage, hand in hand, as the lights dimmed. Behind them, the crowd finally remembered to move. Applause erupted like a dam breaking, but Dzifa was already gone. Back at the center by the sea, the sky had changed. It was dusk again, the same color as the one that had once orphaned her. Only now she wasn't alone. Dozens of children played in the sand. The structure had grown real walls, now a wide roof, even benches. Paintings covered the wood spirals, waves hands. A mural of Dzifa, not in a stage spotlight, but sitting under a tree drumming with her eyes closed. Inside, Ako lay curled at the threshold. The rhythm of the day hummed around him, drumming laughter wind. He didn't chase anymore. He didn't bark. He had stopped limping weeks ago, as if the earth had finally softened beneath him. Dzifa knelt beside him. "Do you hear them?" she asked. His ears twitched. They know the rhythm now. He rested his head on her lap. Her fingers brushed the fur on his face, now gray at the muzzle. She looked up at the sky. The same stars she had once stared into alone, now watching over a village of sound. She didn't cry, but something behind her eyes pulsed. That night, while the children slept inside, curled against one another like newly planted seeds, Dzifa stepped outside to listen. The ocean breathed its constant lullaby. The wind remembered her name, and beside her, Ako exhaled one final time. She didn't realize it at first. He simply quieted. No tremble, no sound, just stillness. She looked down, his body warm, his eyes closed, peaceful. He had gone the way he had lived, watching her, guarding the doorway. She placed her forehead to his, then her drum to his side, and began to play, not for the living, not for the dead, but for the in-between. The rhythm was soft, like sand being swept, then firm like paws on packed earth. She wept, but the rhythm did not. The rhythm held, until the last note echoed into stars. She pressed her cheek to his fur and smiled through the salt. Later, the children found her curled there, fast asleep beside him, a quiet smile on her face. They didn't wake her. They sat beside her and began to drum. The screen fades to black, a voice low, warm, as if spoken across time. No one is born to remain alone forever. A drum struck in grief will always be heard, and someone somewhere will answer with hope.